The transport shuttle hummed quietly as it approached the massive structure floating in the void between stars. Admiral Sarah Chen pressed her face against the viewport, watching as the Galactic Academy grew larger with each passing moment. The station was enormous, easily the size of a small moon, with gleaming metal corridors that stretched for kilometers in every direction. Ships from dozens of different species docked at its ports, their hulls reflecting the light of distant stars. Sarah's reflection stared back at her from the glass. At 35, she looked younger than her years, though the weight of command had left subtle lines around her green eyes. Her brown hair was pulled back in the regulation style, and her uniform bore the insignia of the Terran Defense Force. More importantly, it carried the silver star that marked her as the hero of Kepler Station, the human who had single-handedly saved an entire star system from the Vorthak invasion. The shuttle pilot, a blue-skinned Altarian with 4 arms, turned to address her. "Admiral Chen, we'll be docking in 5 minutes. The Academy Director is waiting to meet you personally." Sarah nodded, though her stomach churned with an emotion she hadn't felt in years: nervousness. She had faced down alien armadas, made split-second decisions that saved millions of lives, and negotiated peace treaties with species that had been at war for centuries. But the thought of walking into a classroom filled her with more dread than any battlefield ever had. 6 months ago, the Galactic Council had made an unprecedented decision. For the first time in the Academy's 1,000-year history, they were inviting a human to teach at their most prestigious institution. The Academy had trained the greatest minds in the galaxy, producing admirals, scientists, diplomats, and explorers from every major civilization. Now they wanted Sarah to share her knowledge with the next generation of galactic leaders. The problem was simple. Sarah Chen was a warrior, not a teacher. She had dropped out of school at 16 to join the military when the Vorthak first appeared at humanity's borders. Everything she knew about tactics, strategy, and leadership had been learned in the heat of battle, not from textbooks or lectures. The idea of standing in front of a classroom filled with alien students, trying to explain concepts she had never formally studied, made her want to turn the shuttle around and head back to Earth. The docking clamps engaged with a metallic thud, and Sarah gathered her few belongings. The Academy had provided her with quarters and promised that everything else would be taken care of. As she stepped off the shuttle, she was greeted by a tall, elegant figure with silver skin and eyes that seemed to shift color in the light. "Admiral Chen," the being said, extending a hand in the human gesture of greeting. "I am Director HFY of the Celestial Conclave. Welcome to the Galactic Academy." Sarah shook the offered hand, noting the surprising warmth of the director's skin. "Thank you for having me, Director. Though I have to admit I'm not sure why you chose me for this position." HFY smiled, an expression that looked almost human despite the alien features. "Your reputation precedes you, Admiral. The battle of Kepler Station is already being studied in our military history courses. But more than that, your species has brought something unique to the galactic community, something we believe our students need to learn." They walked through corridors that seemed to stretch on forever, passing students and faculty from species Sarah had only read about in intelligence reports. A group of crystalline beings that communicated through light patterns paused their conversation as she passed. 3 Vorten students, their reptilian features unmistakable, watched her with expressions she couldn't read. "What exactly am I supposed to teach?" Sarah asked as they entered a lift that moved both vertically and horizontally through the station's complex geometry. "Applied military strategy and unconventional tactics," HFY replied. "Your course will be required for all senior students in the command track, regardless of their species or specialization." The lift opened onto a residential sector, and they walked down a curved hallway lined with doors. Each door bore symbols indicating the species and preferences of its occupant. Some had atmospheric requirements listed, others had warnings about temperature or gravity preferences. "Here we are," HFY said, stopping at a door marked with Terran symbols. "Your quarters have been designed to accommodate human needs. Standard Earth atmosphere, gravity, and temperature. You'll find everything you need inside." Sarah's quarters were surprisingly spacious, with a living area, bedroom, and office space. Large windows provided a view of the stars, and she could see ships coming and going from the station's docking bays. The furniture was clearly designed for human proportions, and she noticed small touches that someone had added to make the space feel more welcoming. A small plant that looked remarkably similar to a fern sat on the desk, and the walls displayed images of various star systems. "Your first class is tomorrow morning," HFY said. "You'll have 37 students from 22 different species. I should warn you, some of them may be challenging." "Challenging how?" HFY's expression grew serious. "Many of our students come from civilizations that have been spacefaring for thousands of years. They study tactics and strategies that have been refined over millennia. Some may question whether a species as young as humanity has anything meaningful to contribute to military science." Sarah felt a familiar stirring in her chest, the same feeling she got before every battle. "They think humans are too primitive to teach them anything. Some do, yes, but others are genuinely curious about how your species achieved so much in such a short time. Humanity went from discovering fire to joining the galactic community in less than 50,000 years. Most civilizations take 10 times that long." After HFY left, Sarah stood alone in her new quarters looking out at the stars. Tomorrow she would face her first class, and she had no idea what she was going to say. She had never taught anyone anything, except by example in the field. The Academy's library contained millions of texts on military theory, written by the greatest minds in galactic history. What could one human possibly add to that vast collection of knowledge? She opened her personal tablet and began reviewing the student roster. The names were a mixture of sounds and symbols that would take her weeks to pronounce correctly. Some came from species she had fought alongside during the war, others from civilizations that had remained neutral. A few were from worlds she had helped liberate. As she prepared for bed, Sarah made a decision. She wouldn't try to be something she wasn't. She wouldn't pretend to have formal education or academic credentials she had never earned. Tomorrow, she would walk into that classroom as exactly what she was, a soldier who had learned hard lessons in a hard war. Whether that would be enough remained to be seen. Sarah woke before her alarm, a habit formed during years of military service. The Academy operated on a standardized time system that approximated a 24-hour cycle, though she suspected her internal clock would take weeks to adjust fully. She dressed in the civilian clothes the Academy had provided, feeling strange without her uniform. The outfit was practical but unfamiliar, designed to be culturally neutral and appropriate for interaction with dozens of different species. The faculty dining hall was a marvel of engineering and diplomacy. Different sections accommodated various atmospheric and dietary requirements. She watched as a methane-breathing Zephyrian ate through a sealed feeding tube, while sitting next to a photosynthetic Verdanian, who absorbed nutrients directly from special lamps. Sarah grabbed a tray and filled it with foods that looked reasonably familiar, though she suspected most of them were synthetic approximations of Earth cuisine. A voice behind her made her turn. "You must be the new human instructor." Sarah found herself facing a creature that looked like a cross between a praying mantis and a scholar. Its compound eyes regarded her with what she hoped was curiosity rather than hunger. The translator device on its collar rendered its clicks and chirps into precise academic speech. "I am Professor Theknor of the Military History Department. I have read your files with great interest. Tell me, Admiral Chen, how does one teach tactics without theory?" The question hit exactly the nerve Sarah had been worried about. "I suppose I'll find out today, Professor. Maybe there's value in learning from someone who developed tactics out of necessity, rather than study." Theknor's head tilted in a gesture that was probably thoughtful. Interesting perspective. "In my species' military tradition, we study the great battles of the past for centuries before commanding a single ship. Yet humans seem to produce effective commanders with remarkable speed. Maybe that's because we don't have centuries to spare," Sarah replied. "When the Vorthak attacked, we had to learn fast or die." Other faculty members began to take notice of their conversation. Sarah found herself surrounded by beings who had probably spent longer studying warfare than humanity had existed as a spacefaring species. Their questions were polite but probing, and she sensed they were trying to determine whether she was worthy of standing among them. The classroom was a circular amphitheater with seats arranged in concentric rings. Each seat could be adjusted for different species' anatomy, and the environmental controls created individual comfort zones for students with varying atmospheric needs. Sarah stood at the center, looking up at 37 pairs of eyes, optical sensors, and other sensory organs she couldn't identify. The students represented the best and brightest of their respective species. She could see the pride in their posture, the confidence that came from being selected for the most prestigious military academy in the galaxy. Several wore uniforms, marking them as already holding junior officer ranks in their home fleets. Others bore decorations indicating academic achievements that probably took decades to earn. "Good morning," Sarah began, her voice amplified by the room's sound system. "I know most of you are wondering why a human is standing here. Some of you are probably thinking this is a waste of your time." A student in the front row, one of the crystalline beings she had seen the day before, pulsed with light patterns that her translator rendered as, "The thought had occurred to us, Professor Chen." Sarah smiled. Direct honesty was something she could work with. "Fair enough. Let me ask you all a question. How many of you have studied the Battle of Kepler Station?" Every hand, appendage, and manipulator in the room raised. "Good. Then you know that a single human destroyer defeated a Vorthak battle group that included 7 heavy cruisers and a dreadnought. According to every tactical manual in this academy's library, that should have been impossible. So tell me, how did it happen?" A student from the middle tier stood. Sarah's briefing materials identified him as Sub-Commander Veltar, a Centaurian whose species had been fighting the Vorthak for over 2 centuries. Superior human technology, obviously. Pure kinetic weapons proved unexpectedly effective against Vorthak shielding. "Wrong," Sarah said flatly. "Our weapons were actually inferior to standard Centaurian armaments. We just used them differently." "Anyone else?" Another student, this one a Vorthan, rose slowly. Sarah felt a moment of tension as she recognized the reptilian features of the species that had once been humanity's enemy before becoming their allies. Perhaps superior numbers? Intelligence reports were often inaccurate during wartime. Also wrong. I was outnumbered 7-1 exactly as reported. The Vorthak had superior ships, superior weapons, and superior numbers. By every logical analysis, I should have died in the first 30 seconds of combat. The crystalline student pulsed again. "Then how did you survive, let alone achieve victory?" Sarah walked to the holographic display at the center of the room. With a gesture, she brought up a 3-dimensional representation of the Kepler system. "Because I did something that violated every rule of engagement you've ever studied. Something so fundamentally wrong that no tactical computer would ever suggest it." The display showed the positions of the ships at the start of the battle. The human destroyer CSS Defiant hung alone near Kepler Station, while the Vorthak fleet approached in perfect formation. Every tactical manual says the same thing about fighting a superior force. Maximize range, use cover, fight defensively, and retreat if necessary. But I did the opposite. The display showed the Defiant's course as a direct line toward the enemy formation. I charged straight at them at maximum acceleration. Murmurs of confusion rippled through the classroom. Sub-Commander Veltar stood again. "That's suicide, not tactics. According to conventional wisdom, yes. But here's what conventional wisdom doesn't account for." Sarah manipulated the display to show the battle from the Vorthak perspective. The enemy expected me to behave rationally. Their formation was perfect for engaging a human ship that followed standard doctrine. But when I charged directly at their flagship, their perfect formation became a liability. The display showed how the Vorthak ships had been forced to maneuver to avoid hitting each other as they tried to target the rapidly approaching human vessel. In their confusion, several had actually collided. "The Vorthak are excellent strategists," Sarah continued. "They had studied human tactics for months and prepared counters for every move we might make. But they couldn't prepare for a move that was completely irrational." A new student spoke up, one Sarah didn't recognize from her briefing materials. The being was tall and ethereal, with skin that seemed to shimmer like starlight. "You advocate for irrationality in combat. I advocate for unpredictability. Every species in this room has military traditions that stretch back thousands of years. Those traditions create patterns, and patterns can be exploited. Humans don't have those ancient traditions. We make things up as we go along, and that makes us dangerous." The Vorthon student leaned forward. "But surely this was an isolated incident. One battle does not make a doctrine." Sarah brought up another display, this one showing ship movement patterns from a dozen different engagements. Human forces won 73% of their battles against technologically superior opponents during the war. We did it by consistently doing things that didn't make sense. She highlighted several examples. Human ships ramming enemy vessels instead of engaging at range, ground forces attacking uphill against entrenched positions, diplomatic negotiations conducted during active combat. Traditional military thinking is based on minimizing risk and maximizing advantage. Human thinking is based on accepting insane risks to create opportunities that shouldn't exist. The crystalline student pulsed rapidly. This seems less like strategy and more like gambling. Exactly, Sarah said. And that's today's lesson. Sometimes the best tactical decision is to ignore tactics entirely. Your homework is to review 3 historical battles where conventional forces defeated superior enemies. I want you to identify the moment where someone decided to break the rules. As the students filed out, Sarah noticed they were talking among themselves with more animation than when they had entered. Some looked thoughtful, others skeptical, and a few seemed almost excited. She had their attention, which was more than she had hoped for. Sub-Commander Veltar approached her as the room emptied. Professor Chen, I have to ask, is this really how humans think about warfare? As organized chaos? Sarah gathered her materials considering the question. Not chaos, Veltar. Improvisation. The galaxy is full of species that have perfected the art of war. Humans are just getting started, so we have to be creative. And you think this creativity is something we can learn? I think it's something you need to learn. Because the next enemy you face might not follow the rules either. 3 weeks into the semester, Sarah realized she had underestimated her students. They had not only completed the homework assignment, but had expanded it into detailed analyses that would have impressed graduate-level researchers. The crystalline student who she had learned was named Resonance of Deep Thought, had identified 17 historical battles where unconventional tactics had achieved victory. Sub-Commander Veltar had written a 40-page paper comparing human improvisation to ancient Centaurian siege strategies. But it was the quiet student in the back corner who surprised her most. Kethara was a Nexari, a species known for their methodical approach to everything. Nexari military doctrine was famous for its precision and predictability. Yet somehow Kethara had found connections between human creativity and her own people's mathematical approach to warfare that Sarah herself hadn't considered. Professor Chen, Kethara said after class, her voice soft but determined. I've been thinking about your lecture on acceptable losses. In Nexari tradition, we calculate the exact value of every life in a battle. But humans seem to make these calculations differently. Sarah leaned against her desk, intrigued. How so? At the Battle of Ross 1-28, Captain Martinez sacrificed his ship to save a civilian transport carrying 300 refugees. By Nexari calculations, trading a destroyer and its crew of 50 for 300 civilians is mathematically sound. But Martinez didn't have time to do those calculations. He just acted. What's your point? Kethara's large eyes showed an emotion Sarah was learning to recognize as confusion mixed with fascination. The point is that he made the right decision faster than our computers could have calculated it. How is that possible? Sarah was quiet for a moment, remembering her own split-second decisions in combat. Maybe because humans don't calculate the value of life, Kethara. We just know it has value. But that's illogical. How can you make optimal decisions without data? Who says our decisions are optimal? Maybe they're just human. That afternoon, Sarah received a message requesting her presence in Director HFY's office. She made her way through the academy's maze-like corridors, past laboratories where students from different worlds worked together on projects that would have been impossible for any single species to complete alone. HFY's office overlooked the academy's central hub, where transport ships arrived and departed in a carefully orchestrated dance. The director stood with their back to the door, watching the traffic flow. Your students are talking, HFY said without turning around. Is that good or bad? That depends on what they're saying. HFY finally turned to face her. Some faculty members are concerned about your methods. Professor Theknor believes you're encouraging reckless behavior. Sarah felt a familiar knot form in her stomach. And what do you think? I think you're doing exactly what we hoped you would do. You're making them question assumptions they've held their entire lives. HFY gestured to a chair and Sarah sat down. But I also think you need to be careful. Some of these students will command fleets within a decade. The lessons you teach them will affect the lives of billions. I understand the responsibility, Director, but if I only teach them what they already know, what's the point? HFY picked up a data pad from their desk. 3 of your students have requested transfers to other sections. They claim your teaching methods are incompatible with their species' military traditions. Sarah's heart sank. Which students? 2 hierarchs and 1 crystalline collective representative, all from species with very structured approaches to warfare. HFY set down the pad. However, 15 other students have requested to audit your class even though they're not in the command track. That's unexpected. Indeed. It seems your reputation is spreading beyond your assigned curriculum. HFY moved to the window again. Tell me, Admiral Chen, what do you think is the most important thing these students need to learn? Sarah considered the question carefully. That there's no such thing as impossible. Every battle I've fought, someone told me it couldn't be won. Every strategy I've used, some expert said it wouldn't work. But here I am. And here you are, teaching the next generation of galactic leaders, some of whom will face challenges we can't even imagine yet. That evening, Sarah found herself in the Academy's observation lounge, a vast, transparent dome that provided a panoramic view of space. Students often came here to study, or simply to think, and she had grown fond of the peaceful atmosphere. She wasn't alone tonight. Resonance of deep thought sat in one corner, their crystalline body pulsing with soft patterns of light. In another section, a group of Altarian students worked together on what looked like a tactical simulation. Near the center of the dome, Sub-Commander Veltar was engaged in animated conversation with a Vorthan student Sarah recognized from another class. Professor Chen, a voice said behind her. She turned to see Cathara approaching, carrying a data pad and looking unusually agitated for a Nixari. Something wrong, Cathara? I've been running simulations based on your lectures, trying to quantify the value of unpredictability in combat situations. The young Nixari's voice was strained. The results don't make sense. What kind of results? Cathara activated her datapad, showing a complex 3-dimensional graph. In every scenario where forces use conventional tactics, the outcome is predictable within a 3.7% margin of error. But when I introduce random elements based on human behavior patterns, the margin of error increases. No, Cathara said, her voice barely above a whisper. The overall success rate increases by 23%. Chaos makes the tactics more effective, not less. Sarah smiled. Chaos isn't the right word, Cathara. Think of it as creative flexibility. But how do you teach creative flexibility? How do you train someone to be unpredictable? Before Sarah could answer, an alarm sounded throughout the station. Not the gentle chimes used for routine announcements, but the harsh, urgent tone that meant emergency. Emergency lighting activated, casting everything in a red glow. HFY's voice echoed through the Academy's communication system. All students and faculty to emergency stations. This is not a drill. Unknown vessels have been detected approaching the Academy. All military personnel to Battle Stations Protocol 7. Sarah felt her training take over immediately. Protocol 7 meant hostile contact with unknown intentions. Around the lounge, students began moving with the practiced efficiency of their various species emergency procedures. The Altarians formed precise formations. The crystalline beings began coordinating through rapid light pulses, and the Centaurians started establishing a command hierarchy. But Sarah noticed something else. Several students were looking to her, waiting for direction, not because she was a professor, but because she was the human who had faced the impossible and won. Cathara, Sarah said, her voice calm despite the situation. You wanted to know how to teach creative flexibility? The young Nixari nodded, her mathematical mind already trying to process the emergency protocols. Lesson 1, Sarah said, heading toward the command center. When the rules don't cover the situation, make up new ones. As they moved through corridors filled with students and faculty responding to the emergency, Sarah realized that her real test as a teacher wasn't happening in the classroom. It was happening right now, with unknown ships approaching and her students looking to her for guidance. The Academy's main command center was a hub of controlled chaos. Officers from dozens of species worked at stations designed for their specific physiologies, coordinating the station's defenses and trying to identify the approaching vessels. Sarah arrived to find Director HFY standing at the central display, their expression grim. "Admiral Chen," HFY said without turning around, "your timing is fortuitous. We have a situation that may require your expertise." On the main display, Sarah could see 3 ships approaching the Academy. They were unlike anything in the Galactic databases, with hull configurations that seemed to shift and change as she watched. "Who are they?" Sarah asked. "Unknown. They appeared at the edge of sensor range 20 minutes ago and have been approaching steadily. They don't respond to communication attempts, and their technology doesn't match any known species." Sarah studied the display more carefully. The ships moved in formation, but their pattern was unlike anything she had seen before. Not the rigid geometry favored by most military forces, but something more organic. Have they made any hostile moves? No direct threats, but they're ignoring all attempts at communication and continuing to approach despite warnings to halt. Behind her, Sarah could hear her students arriving at the command center. Academy protocol allowed senior students to observe during emergencies, as long as they didn't interfere with operations. Looking at the unknown ships, Sarah felt a familiar sensation. The same feeling she had experienced before every major battle of her career. The feeling that everything she thought she knew was about to be proven wrong. "Director," she said quietly, "I think we're about to discover whether these students have been paying attention." The unknown ships had stopped just outside the Academy's defensive perimeter, holding position in a formation that defied every tactical manual Sarah had ever read. They didn't arrange themselves for optimal firing angles or mutual support. Instead, they seemed to be dancing. The 3 vessels moved in slow, complex patterns that created an almost hypnotic effect. "Defensive status report," Director HFY commanded. The Academy's chief of security, a massive Gorvanian whose species was renowned for their military prowess, stepped forward. "All defensive systems are online and ready. Shield generators at full power. The perimeter patrol ships are standing by for orders." Sarah noticed her students clustered behind the main operational area, watching the proceedings with intense concentration. Resonance of deep thought pulsed with rapid light patterns that Sarah had learned indicated high-level data processing. Sub-Commander Veltar was quietly discussing possibilities with his Centaurian classmates. But it was Cathera who surprised her most. The methodical Nexari was staring at the display with an expression of pure fascination. "Professor Chen," Director HFY said, "what do you make of their formation?" Sarah studied the ship's movements more carefully. "They're not following any military doctrine I recognize, but they're also not random. There's definitely a pattern, but it's unlike anything in our databases." "Recommendations?" Sarah was about to respond when a voice spoke up from the student section. Perhaps they're trying to communicate. Everyone turned to see Cathara stepping forward, her datapad in hand. The young Nexari looked nervous but determined. "Explain," HFY said. Cathara activated her pad, showing a complex mathematical analysis. "I've been tracking their movement patterns for the past 10 minutes. The formation changes follow a mathematical sequence that's too complex to be coincidental. They're not positioning for attack or defense. They're creating patterns." The chief of security growled, a sound that needed no translation. "Cadet, this is not the time for academic speculation." But Sarah held up a hand. "Actually, Chief, maybe it is." "Cathara, show me what you found." The young Nexari approached the main display, her movements careful and precise. With the director's permission, she uploaded her analysis to the central system. The display now showed not just the ship's current positions, but their movement patterns over time, represented as flowing lines of light. "Look at the complexity," Cathara said, her voice gaining confidence. "Each ship follows a different mathematical progression, but they're synchronized to create interference patterns. In Nexari mathematics, this type of sequence is used for complex data transmission. Resonance of deep thought pulsed rapidly and spoke through their translator. The Crystalline Collective uses similar patterns for high-level diplomatic communications. But these patterns are far more sophisticated than anything we've developed." Sarah felt pieces of a puzzle clicking together in her mind. "What if they're not hostile?" What if they're trying to introduce themselves? The Chief of Security's expression showed clear skepticism. Admiral, with respect, we cannot assume peaceful intentions based on mathematical speculation. No, Sarah agreed, but we can test the theory. Cathara, can you determine what type of response they might be expecting? The Nexari student worked frantically on her data pad for several minutes. Based on the pattern progression, they appear to be creating a call and response sequence. If I'm correct, they're waiting for us to complete the mathematical statement they've begun. Director HFY looked between Sarah and the student. You want to communicate with potentially hostile aliens using theoretical mathematics? I want to try something that no one would expect, Sarah replied. Cathara, can you calculate the response pattern? I think so, but I'll need to use the Academy's main computational array. HFY nodded to the technical staff, who quickly granted Cathara access to the station's most powerful computers. As the young Nexari worked, Sarah noticed other students beginning to contribute their expertise. The crystalline beings offered insights into pattern-based communication, while the Altarians provided calculations for precise movement coordination. Professor Chen, Sub-Commander Veltar said quietly, "Are you certain about this approach? If these beings are hostile, we're revealing our mathematical capabilities." Veltar, remember the lesson about acceptable risks. Sometimes you have to gamble everything on an impossible possibility. 10 minutes later, Cathara announced that her calculations were complete. I believe I can generate the appropriate response pattern using our patrol ships, but it will require them to move in formation according to this mathematical sequence. She displayed the required movements on the main screen. The pattern was incredibly complex, requiring split-second timing and precise coordination between multiple vessels. That's impossible, the Chief of Security stated flatly. No pilot could execute those maneuvers with the required precision. Actually, resonance of deep thought pulsed. The crystalline collective's navigation techniques might work. We use harmonic resonance to coordinate fleet movements. Another student voice joined the discussion. Altarian tactical doctrine includes synchronized formation flying. We could adapt those techniques. Sarah watched as her students began working together, combining knowledge from their various species to solve a problem that no single military tradition could handle alone. It was exactly what she had been trying to teach them, happening naturally under pressure. Director, she said, I recommend we try it. HFY was quiet for a long moment, weighing the risks. Finally, they nodded. Chief, coordinate with the students. Let's see if we can speak mathematics. The next 20 minutes were controlled chaos as Academy personnel worked with students to program the response pattern into the patrol ship's navigation systems. Sarah found herself in the unusual position of watching her students teach Academy officers rather than the other way around. When everything was ready, Director HFY gave the command. 6 Academy patrol ships moved out from the station's defensive perimeter and began executing Cathara's calculated response pattern. The ships moved in perfect synchronization, creating geometric forms that shifted and evolved in three-dimensional space. The effect was immediate. The 3 unknown vessels stopped their complex dance and held perfectly still for nearly a minute. Then slowly they began a new pattern, this one even more intricate than the first. They're responding, Cathara whispered, her voice filled with wonder. It's working, but the new pattern was beyond anything her calculations had prepared for. The mathematical complexity was staggering, requiring computational power that even the Academy's systems strained to process. Can we respond to this? HFY asked. Cathara shook her head. The mathematical requirements are beyond our current capabilities. I can understand what they're saying, but I can't formulate an appropriate response. That's when another voice spoke up. Maybe we don't need to respond in kind. Everyone turned to see one of the quieter students stepping forward. Tavash was a young Vortan, whose people had only recently joined the Galactic community. Unlike the other students who came from established military traditions, Tavash represented a species that was still developing their approach to interstellar relations. Explain, Sarah said. Tavash gestured to the display. They've escalated the complexity of their communication far beyond what we demonstrated. In Vortan diplomatic tradition, this could mean they're testing our limitations. Perhaps they want to see how we respond when we encounter something beyond our capabilities. Sarah felt that familiar sensation of pieces falling into place. So what would be an appropriate response? Honesty, Tavash said simply. Show them that we know we're out of our depth but that we're still trying to communicate. Sarah looked at the assembled students, then at Director HFY. What do you think? Do we try to punch above our weight or do we admit we've reached our limits? The director was quiet for a moment. Admiral, this is your area of expertise. What does human intuition tell you? Sarah smiled. It tells me that sometimes the best response to a test you can't pass is to show the examiner how you handle failure. Agreed. How do we communicate our limitations? This time it was Resonance of Deep Thought who answered. In crystalline culture, we have a specific pattern that indicates understanding but inability to reciprocate. It's used when one party acknowledges superior knowledge or capability. Perfect, Sarah said. Let's be honest about what we don't know. The Academy ships executed the crystalline pattern, a simple but elegant formation that clearly indicated respect and limitation. The response from the unknown vessels was immediate and surprising. All three ships began moving toward the Academy, but slowly and with their weapon systems clearly powered down. As they approached, one of the vessels began transmitting on standard galactic communication frequencies. The voice that came through the speakers was unlike anything Sarah had ever heard, but the words were clear. Greetings, Academy of Many Species. We are the Wanderers, and we have been watching your lessons with great interest. The Academy's main conference hall had been hastily reconfigured to accommodate beings whose physiology was unlike anything in the galactic databases. The Wanderers appeared to be energy-based life forms, existing as flowing patterns of light within specially designed containment fields. Their representative, who called themselves Echo of First Journey, communicated through harmonic frequencies that created visible ripples in the air. We have traveled the galaxy for many cycles, observing the development of younger species, Echo explained, their words translated by the Academy's most advanced linguistic computers. But never before have we encountered such an unusual approach to education. Director HFY led the formal diplomatic proceedings, but Sarah noticed that the Wanderer's attention kept returning to her and her students. Cathara sat with her datapad, frantically taking notes on every exchange. Resonance of deep thought pulsed in patterns that Sarah recognized as intense concentration. Even Sub-Commander Veltar, normally confident in his knowledge of protocol, seemed fascinated by these beings who existed outside all known classifications. You say you've been watching our lessons, Sarah said, unable to contain her curiosity. For how long? Echo's harmonic patterns shifted to what the translator rendered as amusement. Since the human instructor began teaching. Your methods are unprecedented. Most educational institutions throughout the galaxy follow established patterns. Knowledge is transferred from elder to younger in predictable ways. But your classroom demonstrates something we have not observed before, which is innovation arising from the collision of different ways of thinking. Your students are not merely learning human tactics. They are creating new approaches by combining human unpredictability with their own species' strengths. HFY leaned forward. The Wanderers are known to us through ancient records, though we believed you were mythical. You're said to be the first species to achieve interstellar travel in this galaxy. Indeed. We have been spacefaring for what you would measure as approximately 3 million years. In that time, we have observed the rise and fall of thousands of civilizations. Most follow similar patterns of development. Sarah felt a chill. Similar patterns? Echo's harmonic patterns grew more complex. Species develop technology, achieve spaceflight, establish empires, and eventually stagnate. The cycle repeats with minor variations. Very few civilizations manage to break free from these patterns. And those that do, they evolve beyond the need for physical form as we did. Or they find new ways to think that allow continued growth. This is why your academy intrigues us so greatly. Cathara looked up from her notes. You believe our combined approaches might break the stagnation cycle? We believe something unprecedented is happening here. Your species, Echo gestured toward Sarah, introduces chaos into ordered systems. But chaos alone is destructive. It is the combination with other species' ordered approaches that creates true innovation. Over the next several hours, the Wanderers shared knowledge that revolutionized everything the Academy thought it knew about galactic history. They spoke of civilizations that had achieved wonders beyond imagination, only to collapse when they became too rigid in their thinking. They described species that had traveled between galaxies, exploring realms of possibility that younger races couldn't even conceptualize. But they also revealed a darker truth. Every advanced civilization eventually faced what they called the Great Filter, a test that determined whether a species would continue to evolve or begin the slow decline toward extinction. What is this test? Director HFY asked. Echo's patterns grew subdued. It varies for each species, but the fundamental challenge is always the same. Can they continue to grow and adapt when their existing knowledge becomes insufficient? Most species, when faced with problems beyond their understanding, retreat to familiar solutions. They become conservative, rigid, afraid to risk failure. Sarah felt understanding dawn. And humans? Humans consistently choose growth over safety, innovation over tradition. It is both your greatest strength and your greatest vulnerability. Your willingness to attempt the impossible has allowed you to achieve remarkable things in a very short time. But it has also led to many failures. Subcommander Veltar spoke up. What does this mean for the rest of us? Our species have followed traditional paths for millennia. It means, Echo replied, that you have an opportunity that has never existed before. By learning from humanity's approach while maintaining your own strengths, you might develop new ways of thinking that no single species could achieve alone. The implications were staggering. Sarah realized that her role at the Academy was far more significant than she had imagined. She wasn't just teaching military tactics. She was potentially helping to guide the evolution of galactic civilization itself. There's something else, Echo continued. The reason we chose to reveal ourselves now. We have detected signs that this galaxy is approaching its own version of the Great Filter. The conference room fell silent. Sarah could feel the weight of that statement settling over everyone present. What kind of signs? HFY asked. Echo's harmonic patterns became almost musical, but with an underlying tone that suggested great sadness. The same signs we have observed in countless other galaxies. Increasing conflict between established powers. Technological stagnation disguised as perfection. Growing resistance to new ideas or approaches. Species becoming more isolated rather than more connected. But our galaxy is more united than ever, Veltar protested. The Galactic Council represents hundreds of species working together. Working together to maintain existing systems, Echo corrected. When did the Council last approve a truly revolutionary change? When did any major species last fundamentally alter their approach to governance, technology, or philosophy? Sarah thought about her own experience. The war with the Vorthak. That forced changes. Yes, crisis often does. But sustainable growth requires the ability to change without external pressure. It requires species that can voluntarily abandon successful strategies when they are no longer sufficient. Kithara had been quietly calculating on her datapad throughout the conversation. Now she looked up with an expression of alarm. If I understand correctly, you're suggesting that our entire galactic civilization might be approaching a critical decision point. Continue on current paths and face eventual stagnation, or find new ways to think and grow. Precisely, and the window for making this choice is not infinite. The weight of responsibility settled over Sarah like a lead blanket. How long do we have? Echo's patterns shifted to what the translator rendered as uncertainty. That depends on how quickly new approaches can be developed and spread. The Academy represents the greatest concentration of young leaders from across the galaxy. If change is to begin anywhere, it would most likely be here. Director HFY stood slowly. Are you suggesting that our students might be responsible for guiding galactic civilization through this Great Filter? We are suggesting that they represent the best hope for developing the new approaches that will be necessary. But only if they can learn to think beyond the limitations of their individual species. Sarah looked around the room at her students, these young beings who just hours ago had been struggling with basic tactical concepts, were now being told they might hold the key to their galaxy's future. The responsibility was enormous, but she also saw something else in their expressions. Determination. What happens if we fail? Resonance of deep thought pulsed. Echo's response was gentle but honest. Then this galaxy follows the same path as so many others. Gradual decline, increasing isolation, eventual collapse. Not destruction, but a slow fading of potential. Entire civilizations that could have achieved wonders, instead settling for comfortable mediocrity until they can no longer adapt to changing circumstances. The silence that followed was profound. Sarah could almost feel the weight of millions of years of galactic history pressing down on the room. Finally, Cathara spoke. "Then we don't fail." It was a simple statement delivered with quiet conviction. But somehow, coming from the methodical Nexari who had spent weeks learning to embrace unpredictability, it carried tremendous power. Echo's harmonic patterns brightened noticeably. Now that young scholar is precisely the kind of thinking that gives us hope. 3 months after the Wanderer's visit, the Academy had transformed in ways that surprised even Director HFY. Word of the encounter had spread through carefully controlled channels, reaching the highest levels of galactic government. The result was unprecedented. For the first time in the Academy's history, senior officials from multiple species were requesting to audit classes, not to monitor traditional subjects, but to observe what was being called the Human Integration Protocol. Sarah's classroom had been moved to one of the Academy's largest amphitheaters to accommodate the growing number of observers. Her original 37 students had been joined by volunteers from other tracks, creating a diverse group of nearly 200 beings representing 43 different species. Some came from civilizations so ancient they had been spacefaring before humans had developed written language. Others represented species that had only recently achieved interstellar flight. The assignment Sarah had given them was simple in concept, but revolutionary in practice. Design a completely new approach to interstellar diplomacy, one that had never been tried before in galactic history. Traditional diplomacy, Sarah explained as she walked among the working groups, assumes that different species will eventually find common ground through negotiation and compromise. But what if that assumption is wrong? What if the goal isn't to find what we have in common, but to create something entirely new from our differences? She paused near a group where Cathara was working with a hierarchical representative whose species communicated primarily through complex scent patterns. "How's the progress, Cathara?" The young Nexari looked up from her calculations, her expression showing the kind of excitement Sarah had learned to associate with breakthrough moments. "Professor Chen, we think we've identified something important. Hierarchical diplomatic protocols are based on establishing clear authority relationships, while Nexari methods focus on mathematical optimization of outcomes. But what if we combine them? Explain." The hierarchical student, whose translator, rendered their scent communication as formal, precise speech, gestured to their shared workspace. "Rather than negotiating from positions of assumed equality, we would establish temporary authority hierarchies based on specific expertise in the matter being discussed. The species most qualified to understand the issue would lead that particular negotiation." "And the mathematical component?" Sarah asked. Cathara's excitement was palpable. "We calculate optimal outcomes not just for the immediate negotiation, but for long-term relationship building. The authority hierarchy shifts based on what produces the best results for all parties over time." Sarah nodded appreciatively. "Interesting. But what happens when two species disagree about who has the relevant expertise?" The question sparked an animated discussion between the two students, with input from nearby groups. Sarah watched as the conversation evolved, touching on concepts from game theory, xenopsychology, and political science. Most importantly, she saw students from different species building on each other's ideas rather than defending their own cultural approaches. A soft chime indicated that someone was requesting her attention. She turned to see Director HFY approaching with a being she didn't recognize. The newcomer was tall and elegant, with features that seemed to shift slightly as she watched, making it difficult to determine their exact species. "Admiral Chen," HFY said, "I'd like you to meet Ambassador Velthana of the Shapeshifter Collective. They've come specifically to observe your classes." Sarah inclined her head respectfully. The Shapeshifter Collective was one of the galaxy's most mysterious civilizations, rarely involving themselves in broader galactic affairs. "Ambassador, welcome to the Academy." Velthana's voice carried harmonics that suggested great age and wisdom. "Professor Chen, your reputation has reached even our isolated worlds. We understand you're teaching something called creative flexibility to military officers. Among other things, yes, we find this intriguing. Our species has practiced what you might call ultimate flexibility for millennia. Yet we have contributed little to galactic civilization beyond our own borders. Perhaps there is something to learn from your approach. Sarah gestured toward the working groups. Feel free to observe, though I should warn you, my students ask a lot of questions. Velthana moved among the groups with an observer's practiced ease, but Sarah noticed their attention was particularly drawn to areas where students from traditionally rigid species were experimenting with adaptive approaches. After an hour of observation, the ambassador returned to where Sarah was working with a group trying to design new forms of interspecies art. Your students are attempting to create hybrid cultural expressions, Velthana observed. Combining Altarian mathematical beauty with Vorthon emotional resonance and human unpredictability? Something like that, Sarah agreed, though they're discovering that the result isn't just a combination of existing elements. It's something entirely new. Indeed. And this is what you mean by creative flexibility? Not merely adapting existing approaches but generating novel solutions? Exactly. The galaxy is full of species who have perfected their traditional methods. But perfection can become a trap if it prevents further growth. Velthana was quiet for a long moment, watching as the art group struggled to merge three completely incompatible aesthetic philosophies. In our culture, we change our physical form to suit our environment, but we have never considered changing our fundamental approaches to problem solving. Why not? Because we believed flexibility in form was sufficient. But your students are demonstrating flexibility in thought, which is far more challenging. The class period was drawing to a close, but Sarah had learned to extend discussions when they showed promise for breakthrough insights. Ambassador, would you be willing to share your perspective with the class? Many of my students have never met a shapeshifter. Velthana agreed, and Sarah called for the class's attention. The amphitheater fell silent as 200 beings turned to focus on their unexpected visitor. Ambassador Velthana comes from a species that can literally reshape themselves to meet any challenge, Sarah explained. Ambassador, could you tell us about a time when physical flexibility wasn't enough? Velthana's form shifted slightly, becoming more imposing as they considered the question. Several centuries ago, our people encountered a mathematical puzzle that threatened our entire civilization. A quantum cascade that would have destroyed our home system if not resolved. We could change our bodies to better interface with our computers, alter our brains to process information more efficiently, even modify our sensory organs to perceive the quantum fluctuations directly. But, prompted resonance of deep thought. But the solution required thinking about mathematics in a way our species had never conceived. We needed to approach the problem not as a puzzle to be solved through superior processing power, but as a pattern to be understood through intuitive insight. Sub-Commander Veltar leaned forward. How did you solve it? We didn't, Velthana admitted. A human physicist named Dr. Elizabeth Warren solved it in 17 minutes using what she called imaginative mathematics. She approached the quantum equations as if they were a story rather than a calculation. The amphitheater erupted in discussion as students began grasping the implications. Sarah watched as representatives from species known for their logical approaches began talking excitedly with those from more intuitive cultures. The point, Velthana continued once the discussion died down, is that physical flexibility had made us overconfident. We believed we could adapt to any challenge by changing ourselves. We never learned to change our ways of thinking. And that's what we're trying to learn here, Sarah said, addressing the entire class. Not just how to think like humans, or Taxari or crystalline beings, but how to think in ways that none of our species have tried before. A student from the back of the amphitheater raised a tentacle. Professor Chen, are you saying that our traditional methods are wrong? Not wrong, Sarah replied, but possibly incomplete. Every species in this room has achieved remarkable things using their traditional approaches. But the challenges facing our galaxy in the coming centuries may require solutions that no single species could develop alone. Cathara stood up, her datapad displaying complex calculations. I've been modeling the ambassador's description of imaginative mathematics. If we could combine shapeshifter adaptability, human creativity, and Nixari computational power, the theoretical results are... She paused, double-checking her numbers. Unprecedented. "Show us," Sarah said. Cathara activated the amphitheater's main display, showing her calculations in three-dimensional form. The math was beyond most of the students' ability to follow completely, but the implications were clear. The theoretical problem-solving capacity of a truly integrated approach exceeded the sum of individual species' capabilities by orders of magnitude. This is what Echo of First Journey meant about breaking the stagnation cycle. Resonance of deep thought pulsed rapidly. Individual species reached their limits, but combined approaches could continue growing indefinitely. Ambassador Velthana's form shifted again, this time to what Sarah recognized as expressions of wonder. "Young scholars, you are discussing something that no civilization in our recorded history has achieved. True cognitive synthesis between different forms of 1 year later, Sarah stood before the largest gathering in the Academy's history. Representatives from every major civilization in the galaxy had come to witness what the media was calling the synthesis presentations. The Academy's main auditorium had been expanded to accommodate nearly 5,000 beings, with additional viewing areas set up throughout the station for those who couldn't attend in person. The students' year-long projects had exceeded everyone's expectations. What had begun as academic exercises had evolved into practical applications that were already changing how different species approached complex problems. 3 projects had been selected for full-scale implementation by the Galactic Council, and 2 more were being considered for adoption by individual civilizations. But today's final presentation was different. It came from the combined efforts of all 43 species represented in Sarah's expanded program. Working together on what they called the Galactic Evolution Project, Cathara, now recognized as one of the leading theorists in interspecies cognitive synthesis, stood at the center of the auditorium. Beside her were representatives from each participating species, including Sub-Commander Veltar, Resonance of Deep Thought, and Tavash, whose insights into diplomatic applications had proven invaluable. "Honored delegates," Cathara began, her voice carrying clearly through the auditorium's advanced sound system. "1 year ago, Professor Chen asked us to design something that had never been tried before. Today we present not just a design but a working prototype." The main display activated, showing a 3-dimensional representation of what looked like a space station, but unlike anything in the galactic databases, its structure seemed to shift and flow, incorporating architectural elements from dozens of different species in a harmony that shouldn't have been possible. "We call it the Synthesis Station," Veltar explained. "A facility designed specifically for interspecies cognitive integration, not just a place where different species work together, but where they can literally think together." The presentation that followed was breathtaking in its scope and ambition. The students had designed a facility that could accommodate any known form of life, with environmental systems that could create millions of different atmospheric and gravitational combinations within the same structure. But the real innovation was in the cognitive integration systems. Using modified crystalline harmonic resonance technology, Resonance of Deep Thought pulsed, combined with human neural interface concepts and Nexari computational optimization, we've created a system that allows different forms of consciousness to share thought processes directly. Ambassador Velthana, who had become a regular observer over the past year, shifted their form to express amazement. "You're describing technological telepathy between completely different species." "Not telepathy exactly," Tavash corrected. "More like cognitive translation. Each species maintains their individual thought patterns, but the system allows them to understand and build upon each other's mental processes." Sarah watched from the side of the auditorium as her students explained concepts that would have been considered pure fantasy just 2 years ago. But she also noticed something else. Representatives from species that had never collaborated before were now talking together, already planning how they might contribute to the project. Director HFY stepped forward to address the assembly. "The Galactic Council has reviewed the preliminary proposals for the synthesis station. I'm pleased to announce that we have approved not only its construction, but also the establishment of a new educational track at this academy. The Institute for Cognitive Synthesis will become the first institution in galactic history dedicated to teaching interspecies mental integration." The auditorium erupted in discussion as the implications became clear. This wasn't just another research project or educational program. It was the beginning of a fundamental change in how galactic civilization operated. "Professor Chen," called a voice from the assembly. Sarah looked up to see one of the Galactic Council's senior members, a being whose species she didn't recognize. "The council would like to know if you'll accept the position of director of the new institute." Sarah felt every eye in the auditorium turn toward her. A year ago, she had been a soldier who didn't know how to teach. Now she was being offered the chance to guide what might be the most important educational institution in galactic history. "Council member," she replied. "I'm honored by the offer, but I think you might be asking the wrong person." She gestured toward her students. "These young beings have accomplished something I could never have imagined when I first arrived here. They've proven that the next phase of galactic evolution won't be led by any single species or individual. It will require the kind of collaborative leadership they've already demonstrated." Cathara looked startled. "Professor Chen, are you suggesting—" "I'm suggesting that the institute should be directed by a council representing all participating species, with rotating leadership based on the challenges being addressed. And I'm recommending that the first council should be drawn from the students who created this project." The auditorium fell silent as beings throughout the galaxy's leadership considered this unprecedented proposal. Finally, Echo of First Journey, who had been observing the proceedings from a special containment field, spoke up. "The Wanderers approve of this approach. We have watched countless civilizations struggle with the transition from individual to collective thinking. Those that succeed are always the ones willing to trust their young with unprecedented responsibility." Over the following hours, the details were worked out. The Institute for Cognitive Synthesis would be governed by a council of 12, with positions rotating among species based on expertise and project needs. Cathara was selected as the first coordinator, with Veltar as deputy for military, applications and resonance of deep thought, as chief of technical development. As the formal proceedings concluded and delegates began making plans for the synthesis station's construction, Sarah found herself alone with her original group of students. "Professor," Veltar said, "what will you do now? Will you stay at the academy?" Sarah looked around at these young beings who had become so much more than students. "Actually, I've been thinking about that. The institute will need instructors who understand both traditional approaches and synthesis methods. I think I'll stick around and see what we can learn together." "Together," Cathara mused. "A year ago, that was just a word. Now it's becoming something new." Tavash nodded thoughtfully. "The Vorthon philosophical texts speak of moments when history pivots toward new possibilities. I believe we're living through such a moment." "Maybe," Sarah said. "But if we are, it's not because one species or one approach proves superior to all others. It's because a bunch of young minds from across the galaxy decided that impossible was just another problem to solve." Resonance of deep thought, pulsed with patterns that Sarah had learned to recognize as deep satisfaction. "Professor Chen, when you first arrived, you told us that humans make things up as they go along. But what we've learned is that making things up is only the beginning. The real innovation comes from making things up together." As Sarah looked out through the Academy's vast windows at the stars beyond, she realized that her journey from Oddball instructor to galactic educator was really just beginning. The galaxy was entering uncharted territory, and the navigation would require every form of intelligence working in harmony. She thought about Admiral Chen, the military officer who had arrived at the academy, convinced she had nothing to teach. That person seemed like a stranger now. In trying to share what she knew about human ingenuity, she had discovered something far more valuable, that the greatest achievements weren't born from any single species' brilliance, but from the unexpected magic that happened when different forms of consciousness dared to think as one. The impossible, it turned out, was just the beginning of what became possible when you stopped trying to do it alone. Outside the academy, construction ships were already beginning to gather materials for the synthesis station. In a few years, beings from across the galaxy would come to that facility to learn ways of thinking that had never existed before. Some would fail, some would succeed beyond all expectation, and some would probably discover entirely new definitions of what success could mean. But all of them would be guided by the lessons Sarah's students had taught the galaxy. That the future belonged not to the strongest or smartest or most advanced species, but to those willing to become something greater than the sum of their parts. The legend in the galaxy had been born from an oddball in the classroom. but it would be written by the combined imagination of minds that had learned to dream together.